Hey everybody, welcome back. Pastor Tim here, back in my mobile studio, my car, as we continue to dig in this book, Does God Want Us to Be Happy?, written by Randy Alcorn. And we are in chapter 4 this week, and the title is, What Are Some Christian Myths About Happiness? So as we kick off, let me just kind of recap. One thing is I want to mention God's Girls. Again, this is a Christian bookstore in Northampton where you can pick up this book and other Christian resources. So definitely want to encourage you to shop locally to support them. We've talked so far about the idea of happiness. We talked about the idea of Jesus being happy. We talked about the idea of God wanting us to be happy, kind of broadly. The question last week was really... let me read the actual title chapter right here as I flip to it. Who is the happiest person in human history? And obviously Randy Alcorn makes the case that Jesus was the happiest person in human history. This week he digs into some of the myths that he believes are misconceptions. They're misnomers about the topic of happiness. So he starts off by quoting Edward Lee, he quotes Thomas Brooks, John Wesley, let's see, anybody else here at the beginning? Those three, right, to start things off. And talks about how it's ironic, I think, that you have some of these kind of old-time preachers and pastors who focus on happiness a lot, and yet you have preachers and pastors today who never want to talk about happiness. So it could be easy to say, well, true Christians don't focus on happiness, they focus on other things. But these are some definitely sold-out, well-known, committed, world-changing Christians, and they focused on the topic of happiness. Not exclusively, but they talked about happiness. So there's at least something to be considered in church history when we think about some of the myths or truths connected to the topic of happiness. So the first myth he wants to address is happiness a matter of chance? And he does that based on the etymology of the word, being that happy has a root in the word hap, meaning chance. I love this quote from D.A. Carson, which he shares some exegetical fallacies. Carson says, the meaning of a word cannot be reliably determined by etymology. And what basically we understand here is that while it's helpful to go back to the original meaning of the word, sometimes that's only a small piece of the puzzle. We have to think about, how is the word currently used? What does it actually mean in our modern usage? And he gives a couple different examples of that. Ignorant. The word nice has a root in the word ignorant, or the concept of ignorance. But that's clearly not what we mean in general. We talk about someone being nice. We're not calling them ignorant. We're saying they have kindness in their heart. They have a way that they carry themselves which is pleasant to interact with. So we can't go back to the root of the word happiness and say, oh, the root word is originally this, and based on the etymology, therefore it's not a good word, or it's not ultimately about how we currently understand happiness. So I don't find that to be a common myth. I don't hear a lot of people doing that, but you will hear some people say, well, what's the original word? What's the original language? Sometimes that's helpful, sometimes that's not helpful. I will note to you real quick, while I do think there's certainly a lot of value in learning Hebrew and Greek and studying those, and I'm by no means in any way a master or well-trained in those areas, but I will tell you that when I do dig into the original languages, you'll get some subtlety and nuance in words, but it's pretty rare I look at the Hebrew or the Greek, compare it to a modern translation and go, oh, they were way off. I mean, these editors who are experts in the languages and the context of the ancient Middle East, I mean, these guys are pros. These men and women are pros. And so I usually don't get too caught up in trying to tear apart every single word from English back to the original language, because most times the editors have done a great job actually translating it with a very accurate translation. So that's just some food for thought there. I did appreciate on page 33, he gives us kind of a definition, a contemporary meaning of happiness. He says happiness is a glad and universally desired state of mind. I appreciate that he did that, because when you talk about, oh, are we happy? Does God want us to be happy? We have to ask, well, what do you mean by happy? How do you define it? In the next chapter, he's going to talk about happiness versus joy, which will be interesting to dig into that. He's going to make a case that I think may be different than what some of us would assume. So, but it's nice to have a definition. Page 33, a glad and universally desired state of mind. He then goes on to talk about the topic of happiness versus holiness. And there's a lot of things I liked about this passage. He quotes Psalm 132, verse 9. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, connecting that to the idea of holiness, And let your saints shout for joy, connected to happiness. And so I just wrote a bracket and wrote happy and holy. Those things don't have to be at odds with one another. He talks about the idea of the word blessed and happy and how that all fits together. And then he notes down here at the bottom of page 34, when the Greek is rendered happy and holy, readers can realize, wow, so those who knew God are not only holy, but also happy. Happiness is what I've been searching for. Maybe I should stop dividing my life into church me, in which I try to be holy, and world me, in which I seek to be happy. So he links those two things together, and I think that's a beautiful thing, because true happiness is found in God and in what God's doing and who he is and his nature and how he works with us and how he works in the world. That's where true fulfillment ultimately is going to be found. I love the idea. I heard a pastor, Matt Chandler, say this years ago, but he uses the word flourishing a lot. And I love that, because he talks about the law of God, the direction of God, the directives of God are to lead us to flourishing, i.e., to happiness, i.e. to the way we're supposed to live. Flourishing is kind of a way of stating that we are fully who we're supposed to be in this state of spiritual contentment, emotional contentment, physical contentment, flourishing, right? So God wants us to be flourishing. Ultimately, he wants us to be happy. What we've done sometimes, and this is really important, I think, is we've correlated things and then said, therefore, because these two things are correlated, we're going to throw it all out. Philosophically, I believe that's called the law of the undistributed middle. And that would be kind of the syllogism would be like saying, I have a nose, a rhinoceros has a nose, therefore I'm a rhinoceros. It's connecting things that have something in common, therefore saying they have all things in common. Because the world seeks happiness in a bad way, therefore all seeking of happiness is bad. And that's clearly not what the Bible would teach. I think that's an important thing for us to remember. I love Spurgeon's line here on page 35. Holiness is the royal road to happiness. The death of sin is the life of joy. The more I eliminate sin in my life, the more I find out what true happiness and joy are. And so that's kind of what he's ultimately pushing to. He deals with the topic of joy versus happiness, which he's going to go into more in chapter 5, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. I want to kind of give you some food for thought, some things to consider now. One is, how has this book so far challenged some of your understandings of happiness? Maybe jot that down in a journal, talk with people about it, pray about it. Maybe you're thinking differently about the topic of happiness now. So give that some thought. Consider maybe how you're engaging with the topic differently. I also want to acknowledge that I talked to some folks last week who are a little skeptical about Jesus and his sense of humor and things like that. I want you to think about that. Where are you skeptical still about this topic of happiness or gladness and those types of things? What have you heard from Randy Alcorn so far that you're like, I'm not so sure I agree with that? That's worth thinking about, jotting down, writing down, praying about. There are plenty of areas where I think Randy Alcorn's an awesome writer, a very astute thinker. But there are some areas I give you, there's a couple I can think of off the top of my head where I'm like, I'm not so sure I line up with you on that. So there's some food for thought. Where do you disagree, or are you not fully convinced about the topic of happiness? And last thing I want to do just again is to ask you that question. Who's the happiest person you know, and why would you say so? And is maybe your definition or your thinking about the topic of happiness shifting, and thus you're thinking about the happiest person you know differently, or you're thinking about a new person who has a different form or deeper, truer happiness? So there's some food for thought. Next week we'll be digging into this chapter on, let me flip over to the official title here. It's chapter 5. It's hard to do with one hand while holding the camera here. Chapter 5. Is our joy and happiness at odds with each other? That's a very common thing for people to say. Happiness is fleeting, joy is lasting. Does the Bible back that up? We'll figure that out next week. So, as always, feel free to leave comments, ask questions. You can email me, tcarpenter@bethanychurch.com. Leave comments on Facebook, YouTube, and I'll be checking those out. So, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next week. Take care.